So this new change the default?
Yep, that's one. Well, the rest, obviously the rest, you have to have the full IP address in there as well. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, for the default one to work, you just have to make it look like that.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else have questions? No? Let's see. Okay. Now, okay, I know I get ahead sometimes and I get behind. It all works out. We're kind of there. Okay, so we were talking about file systems last time, and we talked about partitions, we talked about inodes, we talked about symbolic links and hard links. We talked about what those are, what the differences are. We talked about inode may have no links, and files inode number stays the same when moved to another directory on the same device, but if I move it to another device or another partition, it'll get a different inode number, and we'll have to copy all the blocks over to that other partition. We did some examples of that, and I think this is where we ended. So I'm going to skip through this and then talk about how we're going to do the assignment. We can find with inode numbers. There's an example. I'm not going to do that, but I can say I'm looking for this inode number. Go find it. Okay, so and I think briefly we also talked about file systems. Linux, the old Linux file system was ext3. The new Linux file system we're going to use is ext4. I think we mentioned FAT is the old Windows one. VFAT is for small file systems. NTFS is the new Windows one. Anyway, most of the current Linux file systems are ext4. Yeah. Anyway, got distracted for a second. Most of the current Linux file systems use this format, which in ext4 means, okay, we're going to have super blocks that I mentioned, I think, once or not. But inodes, our file system is made up of a bunch of inodes. A super block is just a couple different sections on our partition that keep track of where all the inodes are at. Say that. When I originally wrote these slides, this is probably 3 or 4 years ago when I wrote this, but ButterFS was a newer file system that they anticipated would supersede ext4, and I think pretty much it's not going to now. So I don't know what's going to supersede ext4, but
Why not ButterFS?
I don't know. I can't remember why, but it doesn't seem like they're making as much progress on it as they thought they were. So ext4 is what Ubuntu uses, so that's what we're going to focus on for now. Okay. So we've talked about what a partition is now, and ext partition and inodes, and we've talked about permissions in this class. So ext permissions, file permissions, we've talked about. Now how do we actually do partitioning? So we're going to use a program like cfdisk. Well, we already use cfdisk, but there's other programs you could use to partition your free space. You then run the mkfs command to set up the file system or to format the file system, something like mkfs.ext2 or ext4, whatever it is, and then the partition. Oh yeah, what does this mean? SDB5? Yeah, so second SCSI or SATA drive because of the S on SDB, well actually yeah, S on SDB. Second because of B instead of A, and then the fifth partition on that. So SATA, second disk, fifth partition. SATA or SCSI. Once we format the file system, then we can make a mount point, make a directory on our root file system, and then we mount it using a mount command. Something like mount/dev SDB5 to this directory test mount. When issuing a mount command at the command line, it's only going to persist until you reboot the machine. To make it persist past a reboot, you have to edit the etcfstab file. So if we go look, I don't know if this one's a good one, but we'll see. There's some examples here. So I have to add an entry then until, and this is different than what you guys will see a little bit. But an entry in this that says every time I boot up, go mount this to this path. And so this says, go mount the 6th partition then of my first SATA or SCSI drive, mount it to /home/joe/op, and automatically detect what kind of file system that is. Alternatively, there we could put the file system type like ext4 or NTFS or FAT. And then there's a whole slew of options we could use when mounting the file system, like read-only, stuff like that. I think for this class, all we're going to worry about is using the defaults. And then the last 00, we'll just always put 00. It's beyond the scope of the class to worry about what those mean. So, yeah, there we go. I just said all. One more note about FSTAB. Ubuntu now uses a universally unique identifier to identify partitions. So we can still use like dev SDA1, but when I looked over here, you could see stuff like this, which is really weird. Instead of /dev whatever. It uses a universally unique identifier to refer to that hard drive and that partition and tell it where to mount to. And I'm just throwing this out. I'm not going to have you do this, but because I'm going to let you just use /dev SDA1, /dev SDA10, whatever it is. But more and more, as Linux is moving away from using that terminology to using an identifier to refer to the partition rather than dev SDA1. So the primary reason for that is, say that you've plugged another disk into your computer and booted up. It probably won't happen, but it's possible that the new disks might be identified as dev SDA, causing the system to look for the contents of /boot on that first partition of the disk. So in other words, it just makes it, we can uniquely identify disks a little bit better, and then if we were swapping them in and out or something, they would still be unique, and anyway, it might mitigate some problems. One of the last things I'll talk about, we talked about there's two partitioning schemes. There's DOS and there's GPT. GPT, this is the newer way of doing stuff. This is the older way of doing stuff, and this involves the 4 primary partitions. We can take one of those, make it an extended partition, and then inside of that, we can make a bunch of logical partitions. That's what DOS partitioning scheme allows us to do. GPT is the newer way. It's more advanced, and it allows us to have a lot more partitions. It doesn't use this scheme at all. But I'm going to beg off talking about that one. I get more into that one in my file systems class. But related to the DOS partitioning scheme is MBR, this concept of MBR. And sometimes I even call this an MBR partitioning scheme. Sometimes you hear that. But MBR stands for Master Boot Record. So think about this for just a second. When the machine boots up, we all know that there's some firmware on our motherboard that has the BIOS, basic input-output system, on it. That has just a series of instructions that say where to go, what partition to go to boot up the rest of the system. Well, the information about how a hard disk has been partitioned is stored in its first sector. That is, the first sector, the first track on the first disk surface. This first sector is the master boot record of the disk. This is the sector that the BIOS reads in and starts when the machine is first booted. The master boot record contains a small program that reads the partition table, checks which partition is active, or the partition that's marked bootable, and reads the first sector of that partition, the partition's boot sector. The boot sector contains another small program that reads the first part of the operating system stored on that partition, assuming it's bootable, and then starts it. So, some of you have taken maybe IT-1200, have you taken that? 8 plus?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you guys talk about tracks and sectors.
I think we